Doors closing.
Morning.
Morning. Geez, you look like you've been chased. What happened?
There were 3 cops at the entrance to the station with dogs. And all 3 of those police dogs barked at me like I was some kind of criminal.
Wait, hold on. Did you try to pet him?
Come on. I know better than that. But seriously, they went nuts as I walked by. I didn't know what their problem was.
Well, I mean, you do look a little suspicious. You know, if I were a police dog.
Oh, please. I must have smelled like something they didn't like. But it was also so weird. Every single one of them barked at me.
Maybe you've just got that suspicious nurse look down pat. Did you sneak any syringes in your bag or something?
This is Oak Park. This is a Blue Line train to downtown and
Yeah, that must be it. Must have been the stethoscope that set them off.
Excuse me, does anyone have any spare change? Anything would help.
Yes, but I'll only give it to you if you can answer these questions 3.
Cheap bastard.
Nice one. Very holy grail of you.
I thought it would work. Guess not everyone appreciates little Monty Python at 3 in the morning.
This is Tales from the Blue Line by Auditory Anthology.
So, today I've got a story my boss told me, one that supposedly happened to her mom back when she was a nurse in New York City in the 50s.
Ooh, I like it already. What's the story?
It's about this mysterious patient who had the ability to heal people just by touching them. But there was a catch.
The noise of the bustling hospital filled the air. Phones ringing, footsteps echoing down the hallways, and the constant low murmur of voices. It was another chaotic day in the heart of New York City in the 1950s. Nurse Evelyn Carter was in the middle of it all, doing her best to keep things running smoothly. A man had been found unconscious on the steps of a church, his body limp and weak. Dr. Mitchell, the head of the hospital's medical staff, looked over the man as they wheeled him into a room. "No identification, no belongings, no signs of trauma," he muttered. "What's wrong with him?" His heart rate, blood pressure, and reflexes were all stable, yet the man remained unresponsive, his body appearing fragile as though something was sapping his strength. "He doesn't seem to be in immediate danger," Dr. Mitchell said, "but we need to figure out what's going on." Evelyn was no stranger to strange patients coming through the hospital, but something about this man felt different. His stillness was almost unnerving, and the pale, almost translucent quality to his skin made him seem like he was fading away before her eyes. As the day wore on, Evelyn checked on him frequently, though there was little change in his condition. The nurses whispered about him. Some speculated he was a runaway. Others thought he might be homeless. But it wasn't until the next day, when the mysterious patient opened his eyes, that things began to get truly strange. The first sign came when Evelyn walked into his room to find him sitting up, his eyes alert but distant, as though he were looking through the walls. A nearby patient, a man in critical condition from a car accident, had been fighting for his life for days. That morning, his condition had worsened. Doctors were preparing for the worst. Evelyn watched as the John Doe, barely strong enough to lift his hand, reached out, brushing his fingertips against the edge of the bed next to him. The gesture seemed absent-minded, as though he wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. The monitors attached to the injured man next to him began to stabilize. His breathing, once shallow and erratic, evened out. The color returned to his face, and within minutes, the doctors rushing into the room found him in a stable, almost healthy condition. Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief. She had witnessed the transformation with her own eyes, and standing beside her, pale and exhausted, was John Doe, his face now drawn and gaunt as though the life had been drained from him. She hurried over to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What did you just do?" she whispered. her voice barely audible. John Doe's eyes met hers, tired and sorrowful. "I healed him," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "But I can't keep doing it. Not for long." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? You healed him? How?" "I can take their pain away," he replied, his hand trembling slightly. "But every time I do, I get weaker. Soon I'll be too weak to do anything at all." "What's your name?" Evelyn asked. "Ed," he said. "Ed Graham." The hospital was buzzing with the miraculous recovery of the accident victim, but no one could explain it. The doctors chalked it up to luck and modern medicine. But Evelyn knew better. She had seen it with her own eyes. She couldn't shake the image from her mind as she made her rounds. She found herself returning to Ed's room. Ed was awake, sitting up in bed, his face still pale and gaunt. He looked even weaker than before, as if just getting out of bed was an enormous effort. Evelyn closed the door behind her and approached him quietly. "I need to know what happened," she said. "I saw what you did. You healed him. How was that possible?" Ed sighed, his eyes weary, and for a long moment he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was a raspy whisper. "I've been able to do this for as long as I can remember," he said. "I can take away people's pain, heal their wounds, their illnesses, but it always comes at a cost." "What cost?" Evelyn asked. "Every time I heal someone, I take on their suffering," Ed explained. "It weakens me, drains me. The more serious the illness or injury, the more it takes out of me. That man, the one I healed this morning, he was on the brink of death. I gave him everything I had left." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "But why? Why do you keep doing this if it's killing you?" "Because I can't stand by and watch people suffer when I know I can help them," Ed said. "It's a gift and a curse. I've been moving from place to place, healing whoever I can, but I don't know how much longer I can keep going." "Why haven't you told anyone?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who would believe me?" Ed asked. He paused, staring at his trembling hands. "And even if they did, what could they do? I don't want to be some experiment. I just want to help people, as many as I can." Evelyn hesitated, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "How did you, when did you first realize you could do this?" "I was 13, Ed said. "My little sister, Lily, got sick. Scarlet fever. Back then it was a death sentence for most kids in our town. She was burning up, struggling to breathe. My parents couldn't afford a doctor, so they just sat by her bed, waiting for the worst. I don't know what came over me," Ed said, "but I took her hand and begged, prayed for her to get better. I didn't know what I was doing, just that I had to do something. And then I felt it, this rush, like a part of me was being pulled away. When I opened my eyes, she was sitting up, her fever gone like it had never been there." Evelyn's breath caught. "And you?" "I collapsed," Ed said. "I thought I was dying. My parents thought it was exhaustion from sitting up with her all night. They never made the connection. And I didn't either, not until a few years later, when something similar happened again. A neighbor was hurt in an accident, bleeding badly. I grabbed him to stop the bleeding, and the same thing happened. He recovered, And I didn't bounce back so fast. Evelyn shook her head in amazement. You've been carrying this all by yourself ever since? I had to, Ed said quietly. At first I thought it was a blessing, but the more I used it, the more I realized it's a curse, too. For every life I save, a part of me slips away. But how do you stop when you know you can make a difference? And no one else knows? Evelyn asked. Not your family? Friends? He shook his head. I left home not long after I figured it out. If they knew, they'd never let me stop. Or worse, someone would find a way to use me. So I've been drifting ever since, helping where I can, but always moving on before anyone can ask too many questions. As she stood there, a nurse rushed in, breathless and frantic. Evelyn, we need you in the children's ward, now! There's a boy! He's not going to make it through the night! Evelyn's heart sank. She turned to look at Ed, who had already understood what the nurse was saying. His eyes met hers, filled with quiet determination. I can help him, Ed whispered, struggling to stand. Evelyn stood, frozen, her heart racing as she processed Ed's words. She watched as he tried to push himself out of bed, his body trembling with the effort. He was so weak now, barely able to stand, yet he was still willing to sacrifice himself to help another patient. I can help him, Ed repeated. Evelyn rushed to his side, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Ed, you can't keep doing this. You're too weak. If you heal this boy, it could kill you. Ed paused, looking up at her with eyes filled with quiet desperation. I've made peace with that. If I can save him, it's worth it. Evelyn's mind raced as she looked between Ed and the door to the children's ward, where the young boy's life hung in the balance. She knew what the doctors had said. The boy's condition was critical, and his chances of surviving the night were slim at best. And yet, here was Ed, offering a chance. There has to be another way, she whispered, her voice breaking. You don't have to do this. Ed shook his head slowly, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I've been running from this for a long time, but this is why I'm here. I was given this gift for a reason, and if I can use it to save even one more life, I have to. As the seconds ticked by, Evelyn thought of the young boy's parents, waiting anxiously outside the ward. She thought of the doctors doing everything they could, but knowing that the boy's chances were slim. And she thought of Ed, ready to give everything to save a life he didn't even know. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps outside the room. Dr. Mitchell was approaching, and she knew he would want to transfer Ed for more tests that would delay everything. Evelyn made her decision. I won't stop you, she whispered, her voice barely audible, but please, be careful. Ed nodded, weakly. His legs wobbled under his weight, and she wrapped an arm around him, supporting him as they made their way to the children's ward. The walk felt like an eternity, with every step drawing them closer to the moment of truth. As they entered the ward, the boy's small body was hooked up to various machines. His breathing labored, and the doctors nearby exchanged grim looks, preparing for the worst. Ed approached the boy's bedside. His face had a mixture of exhaustion and purpose. He reached out a trembling hand and gently placed it on the boy's forehead. For a brief moment, the air seemed to hum with energy. Then the monitors began to change. The boy's breathing steadied, his heart rate stabilized, and color slowly returned to his cheeks. The doctors stood in stunned silence, unable to explain the sudden turnaround. But Evelyn didn't focus on the boy. Her eyes were locked on Ed. She watched as his body sagged, his strength draining away with each passing second. His face grew paler, his breathing more labored. He was fading. Ed's hand slipped from the boy's forehead, and he collapsed into a nearby chair, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing. Evelyn rushed to his side, tears brimming in her eyes. "Ed!" He looked up at her, his face ashen but calm. "It's done," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Evelyn took his hand in hers, feeling how cold and frail it had become. She knew he didn't have much time left, and the weight of that realization crushed her. This man had given everything to save others, and now he was paying the price. The room around them was silent, the doctors too stunned by the boy's sudden recovery to say anything. They hadn't seen what Ed had done. They couldn't understand. Evelyn knelt beside Ed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. Ed smiled faintly, though his strength was fading quickly. "I did. It's why I'm here. To help." As he spoke, his voice grew weaker, his breaths more labored. Evelyn held his hand tightly, trying to fight back the overwhelming sorrow that was threatening to consume her. She had never met anyone like Ed, someone so selfless, so willing to give up their own life for the sake of others. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please." But Ed's eyes were already closing, his body slumping deeper into the chair. He was at peace, his purpose fulfilled. Evelyn could only watch as his breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. The man who had saved so many was gone. The doctors and nurses were left speechless. The young boy's miraculous recovery would be written off as a medical mystery, something that couldn't be explained by science. Dr. Mitchell, who had been preparing for the worst, was bewildered by the sudden turn of events, but he didn't press Evelyn for answers. Evelyn quietly arranged for Ed's body to be taken away. She didn't tell anyone about what had truly happened in that room. She knew no one would believe her. And even if they did, what good would it do? Ed had wanted to help people, not to be turned into a spectacle. As the hospital resumed its usual rhythm, life moved on. The boy recovered fully, and his family was grateful, though they would never know the true cost of his survival. Evelyn, however, would never forget. She carried Ed's memory with her, a reminder of the extraordinary sacrifice he had made. Even if his gift, or curse, seeped into her as he passed. Now she could feel it, and understood why Ed did what he did. She, too, felt she had to save as many souls as she could while she still had time.
You know, I swear I've heard that story before. I think it was a Twilight Zone episode.
Close, but nope. My boss loves that show, but she swore the story really happened to her mom.
Or maybe she just assumed no one would notice they recognized the story.
Maybe it wasn't on a TV show at all. I'm just telling you what I heard. Whether or not it really happened, who knows?
Yeah, well, either way, it's a good story. The whole healing powers at a cost thing definitely makes you think.
Yep, sacrifice for the greater good. Or maybe just some crazy coincidence. Guess we'll never know for sure.
This is Illinois Medical District. This is a Blue Line train to downtown.
So tomorrow morning?
O'Hare.
You've got another strange story ready for the group?
Group, it's just the two of us. And Calvin, if he hears what's going on while he's driving the train.
Later, Mason.
Don't worry, I'll have a story that'll make yours look like a random Tuesday.
Doors closing.
Tales from the Blue Line by Auditory Anthology is written and produced by me, Keith Conrad. Your narrator is Darren Marlar. Be sure to check out Darren's award-winning paranormal podcast, Weird Darkness, available at WeirdDarkness.com and your podcast app of choice. If you have a story you'd like to contribute to the series, you can visit submissions.soundconceptmedia.com or just follow the link in the show notes.